Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. We are, I guess this is our third seminar we're giving or webinar we're giving where we're introducing some of our beef ruminant nutritionists or ruminant researchers, I should say, our beef researchers in the animal science department. Tonight we have Dr. Dave Harmon, and I'm going to give a little bio and brag on him in a minute. Before we do that, let's remember, like we have been doing, if you have any questions, Dr. Harmon's going to go first, and then if you have any questions, just type them in the chat box, and we will answer those. If we see any pertinent questions that we have to interrupt Dave, I mean, that'd be fine with you, but mostly we'll just handle those questions at the end. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Harmon. David Harmon was born in Columbus, Ohio. He received his BS in nutrition from Ohio State, PhD and master's and PhD from the University of Nebraska. I guess his first stint out of graduate school was at Kansas State University. He joined the faculty there in '83 and then moved to UK in 1991. He actually started at UK the same year I did. So way back in 1991, as my kids say, the 19s. So Dr. Harmon has been a pioneer in developing and utilizing surgical techniques to study ruminant digestion and metabolism. His work in the area of ruminant and small intestinal starch utilization has improved the understanding of factors that limit starch utilization in ruminants. His research program has maintained a high degree of productivity. He has authored and co-authored 194 peer-reviewed articles and more than 250 abstracts and research reports. He has been recognized with several awards. In 2005, he won the Corbin Award for Companion Animal Biology. In 2006, the UK College of Ag T.P. Cooper Award for Research. In 2010, Dr. Harmon received the George Mitchell Award for Outstanding Service to Graduate Students. And then in 2012, the American Society Animal Science Research Fellow Award. So numerous awards. What I like about his bio is he didn't list these awards. I dug this out of his curriculum vitae. So, but what I was most impressed with was the last line in the little the bio he sent me. Dr. Dave Harmon feels his greatest achievement is the nearly 50 students he has mentored to advanced degrees and the training he's provided. So, researcher and educator at heart. Admirable, passing the torch to the next generation. So I think it's a real treat to have Dr. David Harmon tonight, and he is going to talk about ruminant physiology and nutrition research. So Dr. Harmon, take it away.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it very much, and hopefully, is that working like it's supposed to before
That looks good.
Okay, so my goal this evening, when Dare asked if I do this, was to share a little bit about our research program and what we do. So I just tried to summarize that from a lot of different angles and try and get at that. And so what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about graduate education, since that's what I spend a lot of my time on, and kind of give you a mini overview of our beef research program, not only mine, but more the overall people involved at UK, and then a little bit more specifically about what I do in terms of my position, like I said, as Director of Graduate Studies and also coordinator of the Beef Research Unit, so interact with a lot of people there. And then finally, I'll talk just a little bit about my research interests, which are starch utilization, and then some work on fescue toxicosis that we've done recently. So that's my plan. All right, so we'll talk first about graduate education. Obviously, it's a big part of our program at UK, and what I do specifically, in terms of our master's and PhD students pursuing advanced degrees in a specialized area. And so for our master students, this is usually about a 2 to 2.5 year program after their bachelor's. For PhDs, that would be a master's plus an additional 3 to 4 years, okay? And so in our program, many of these students are supported on what we entitle graduate research assistantships. And so for that, our master students get about $14,000 a year. PhD students average about $20,000 a year. I always like to tell them, you can get money for food or housing, you choose. That's about all that we can cover in terms of that. But we also cover tuition, and we cover health insurance. So that package, if you look at that for a PhD student for 3 years, is about $100,000 in a grant. So it's a lot of money that goes into supporting our grad students, a lot of resources. Typically, you know, for the last 30 years, we've had 40 to 50 graduate students in our program, as high as 60. But now we're down to about 30. Some of that obviously is the COVID crisis, and that we haven't admitted any new students recently because of that. And some of it, I think, is just attrition and cost in terms of fewer faculty in our department. And like I said, the cost of doing it, like I said, has resulted in a decrease. Within that, like I said, within our department, like I said, students need to specialize. Like I said, we have the food science program in the animal science department. Historically, the biggest part of our graduate program has been animal nutrition, and that will cover all the species that we typically deal with in our department in animal nutrition. In terms of reproductive physiology, that was Phil that you heard last week, if you were able to attend that. And then some management. And so then students need to choose, obviously, a species. We cover beef and dairy cattle, equine, poultry, sheep, and swine. And so in terms of designated areas, okay, for their programs. In terms of our faculty in beef research, obviously myself, you're going to hear Dr. McLeod and Dr. Van Zant and Dr. Matthews as part of this program. Those would be the 3 colleagues of mine that would make up the beef research faculty in animal science. We also have a USDA research lab within the College of Agriculture, and just thought I'd mention that. They have 5 scientists. 3 of those, Dr. Klotz, Dr. Fleith, Dr. Harlow, are animal people. So they actually use the beef research facilities at UK and share those with us. And so we do a lot of work and interact a lot with these folks in sharing resources and research interests. And so we do a lot of cooperative research with them as well. So just didn't know if everyone was aware of that. So my research interest historically, before I came to UK, has been carbohydrate digestion and metabolism. I've always been interested in that, kind of stumbling onto some things I didn't understand a long time ago, and have spent a career trying to figure them out. Specifically, I'm interested in cattle-fed high-grain diets. I know we don't finish a lot of cattle in Kentucky, but a lot of our cattle get finished, and so I think it's an important area to continue to study. My focus obviously has been high-grain feeding, but particularly starch digestion in the small intestine, in terms of enzymes there, in terms of their regulation, things that limit that, and how we might enhance that. If you think about the big picture of a cattle fed a high-grain diet, obviously the rumen's the major driver there in terms of digestion. And so, but typically on these high-grain diets, starch digestion can be anywhere from 50 to 90% in the rumen. So conversely, 10 to 50% of that starch is available to the small intestine. So it can be quite large amounts. So if you think of a cattle fed 20 pounds of a high grain diet, that can be, 12, 14 pounds of starch that enters the rumen. And so you can have half of that. So 5 to 7 pounds reaching the small intestine. So it can be quite a bit that's available for digestion there. So it is a pretty significant opportunity, I think, in terms of impacting digestion. And so one of the things I think that's kept me interested in that, and that cattle, I think, are, at least in my readings and study for over a career, are unique in terms of their ability to digest starch. So if you think about what can happen, obviously we have the rumen, the major player there, can be digested in the rumen. If not digested in the rumen, it can be digested in the small intestine. And if not, it can be digested in the large intestine. It can be fermented there by microorganisms. And so the first 2, the rumen and the small intestine, are good. Third one's bad, in that the large intestine is very inefficient. We want to avoid that. We want to make sure all the carbohydrate that we feed is digested in the rumen and the small intestine. So the first player that gets involved in this would be the pancreas and amylase in the small intestine. And then ruminants, again, are unique in terms of how they respond to dietary starch. If you think about you or I, or a pig or a chicken, if you feed them a high starch diet for a long period of time, like we do with cattle, they adapt. They produce more enzymes that enable them to digest starch. So they'll produce more amylase when you feed a high starch diet. Cattle do not. They do just the opposite. They produce less. Okay. What seems to be the major driver in how they respond is protein. Okay. So if you think about ruminal fermentation, successful ruminant fermentation results in digestion, but it also results in microbial growth. So we produce more microbial protein that is available, and that seems to be the major regulator of digestion in terms of upregulating digestion. So that's kind of unique among other species, just don't respond like that. If you look at the next step in the small intestine, those mucosal enzymes, if you look at what's there in ruminants, well, there's no sucrase activity. Well, if this were you or I, that would be a disease. Sucrase deficiency is a disease in humans. It causes problems, and that's the normal for cattle. So they have a very limited ability to do what we ask them to do. And certainly, you know, evolutionary wise, when they evolved as forage utilizers, they didn't really need this ability. But under our management systems, they really do. And so we're starting to understand a lot more about this. These enzymes, not only are they missing key components, but again, just like the amylase, they're a little influenced by diet. In other words, they don't upregulate when you feed high grain diets like other species do. And so there's a lot going against them in terms of trying to optimize this system. Again, if you compare cattle to other species, again, most of the pig, the chicken, they're really efficient. You know, starch digestion in the small intestine of the pig, 99.99%. It's just all gone. You know, and the dog, it's all gone, right? But cattle, maybe 60%, okay, in terms of digestive efficiency in the small intestine. And so it's quite limited, okay? And so to get around that, obviously we impose a high degree of processing, okay, and to ensure that we get not optimum, but acceptable starch utilization. Okay. All right, the second area that I wanted to just touch on briefly then would be fescue. Obviously, you all deal with fescue toxicosis on a daily basis, and you're all familiar. This is just some old data I used to make a point about, well, when we put cattle on fescue, they just don't do as well, right? This would be an average across these studies, 43% reduction in gain. Well, why is that? Okay, what are the components that allow them or prevent them from performing better on this? Well, certainly the first thing you think about is intake, right? They don't like the stuff. They don't want to eat it. Well, intake is lower, absolutely, okay? But there's about a 12% reduction in these studies in intake. And so it doesn't explain all the reason as to why performance is so greatly reduced. And so we've tried to take a look at this in a number of studies. If you look at this, and this, I just use this slide to make a point when we do these kind of studies, a couple of things. One, we're doing them at 2 temperatures. So in this setting, the 22 degrees centigrade, that would be 72, right? The ideal temperature on your sunny spring day, right? So they're very comfortable. Or we do them at 30, so that would be 86 degrees and high humidity to boot, okay? So they're heat stressed somewhat in that setting. And so when you do that and you feed them endophyte infected, that would be the E+, obviously intake is going to decrease, okay? And that's what you see. When you apply heat particularly, you get a reduction in intake. So that's one aspect to keep in mind. The other thing is just in these kind of studies, we have to go to great extremes to keep intake equal because it is such a big variable when you apply heat and with the endophyte infection. We always try and pair the control animals with the treated animals so we get equal intakes and we can actually compare one to the other. And even that has its limitations in terms of doing that. So this is just another part of this, and I think we've known for a long time that these toxins cause vasoconstriction. Okay, that's been, I think, a well-known component of fescue toxicosis for a number of years. All right, and that causes a lot of problems on many levels. Okay, and so we've paired up with Dr. Klotz in the USDA in a number of studies looking at ways in terms of assessing this vasoconstriction. And this is just a picture of his myograph setup. And so each of these little chambers here, this is a close-up of that. And so what he does in this little chamber, you can see this little section here is a cross-section of blood vessel. And it's placed on these two wires, and then you incubate those with various chemicals. And you can measure then vasoconstriction. So when that blood vessel contracts, you get to measure the amount of tension there. So he can use this system to study then these toxins in this kind of setup. So if you look at this, this would be the classic ergovaline. Okay, this would be this chemical structure here would be ergovaline. Don't worry, Jeff, it's not on the quiz. And this graph then represents concentration of ergovaline. So as we go from left to right on this scale, concentration goes up. And then this would simply be contractile response or vasoconstriction. So if you go, as you increase concentration of ergovaline, this is the classic response. And the problem, the major problem that we understand of fescue toxicosis is that these blood vessels constrict. And this shows that very well. As the concentration of toxins go up, constriction goes up, okay? So if you think about that, then the problem is obviously as beef producers is reduced growth, right? Cattle don't perform as well, okay? But if you look at that, intake doesn't explain it all. So we've done a number of studies to try and understand what are the components of this that contribute to reduced performance independent of intake, if you will. So obviously the major thing that I think first comes to mind when you talk about vasoconstriction, it's heat tolerance. Cattle don't handle heat well, okay? They can't dissipate heat because blood vessels are constricted on the periphery, right? I think that's a given and a well-known commodity. We've also looked at other blood vessels in the gut, and we can show that actually nutrient absorption is impaired when the ergots are present, okay, in the rumen of these in terms of doing that. We've been able to show energy balance in terms of the way the animal uses energy is impaired in these cattle. More recently, we've gotten into some measures of rumen motility, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and how it's affected by these toxins. And like I said, most recently would be feeding behavior, how that's impacted. So in the process of studying nutrient absorption and the problems with ergots and nutrient absorption, we were using a model whereby we would empty the rumen, take all the contents out, rinse it out, and fill it up with buffer and place volatile fatty acids in there. And we could measure absorption and look at the impact of these toxins on VFA absorption. Okay, so when we emptied the rumen contents, everybody was always going, man, these animals are really different. Okay, and so when we measure how much was actually in the rumen, this is at thermal neutral conditions, so the sunny and 72. Animals that are on the E plus had much greater contents in the rumen, all right, than the control animals. At heat stress, they have even more contents in the rumen and a bigger difference than control animals when we subjected them to heat stress. And so something's going on here in terms of how this is impacted. And so this picture just shows you this here on the right is rumen contents from an high endophyte diet. This on the left is rumen contents from a control animal fed the same amount of feed every day, okay? The same diet, the difference is we were just adding high endophyte, low endophyte fescue seed at about 1 kilogram a day. So both got seed. One of them was E plus, one of them was E minus. Okay, and you can see the difference that it has there. And it is a big difference on ruminal fill. And so that's what got us really interested in rumen motility is, wow, is this stuff having some impact on motility? If you think about, well, rumen motility is not something you usually think about in the impact of that, but it's incredibly important. Okay, and this diagram is one we use in teaching ruminant nutrition and just thinking about what's going on there. Well, it shows you how digestive moves. And within those stomachs, it is incredible the amount of work that goes on in moving those large amounts of feed stuff around to ensure that it's well mixed, number one, and it's more extensively and rapidly fermented because of that. Number two, this motility also involves in terms of rumination, in terms of then breaking down particles so that it can be further fermented. It aids in terms of moving digesta out of the rumen. If you can't move it out of the rumen, you can't eat more. So it has a huge impact on that in terms of motility. Okay, so it's really an important process that really, as ruminant nutritionists and physiologists, we don't really know a lot about. Yeah, it's been studied, it's been characterized, but it hasn't been really looked at in a lot of feeding situations. So here's one I put in for Dare so that he could comprehend. This is some really high-tech stuff here. This is a research balloon, right? We fill these up with 2 liters of water, and we put them in the rumen, right? Then on the outside, we attach it simply to a pressure transducer. So when that rumen contracts, it squeezes the balloon, and we can measure the amount of pressure that's generated. Okay, and so this allows us, this kind of system allows us to study motility. And so what we get, it looks like this. Okay, we get a tracing like this for each animal. And so this then on this axis would be rumen pressure. So when that rumen contracts, it squeezes the balloon and generates a pressure. That would be what we call amplitude. How tall is the peak? How great is the pressure? And then we look at simply the frequency. How many peaks are there? How many contractions are there over a day? You can see this here in 60 seconds. There's 3 primary contractions. That's huge. Look how active that is. It's really amazing how mobile that stomach is and the work that it does. Okay, and so we look at this again over an entire feeding period and characterize what the impacts of these are. All right, so what do we see? Well, when we look at this, yeah, there is an impact of motility, right? So this would be cattle fed 5, 10, 15, 20 micrograms per kilogram of ergovaline. So increasing concentrations of the toxin. And we do see some decrease in the frequency of contractions, okay, how often they occur as the concentration goes up there, all right? If you look at the amplitude, that would be how tall the peak is, how tightly that stomach squeezes the balloon. We really don't see any change there to speak of across all those, you know? What we really saw was the bigger player was feeding behavior, okay? Remember back when I talk about when we do these kind of studies, we really got to equalize intake, got to feed them the same amounts. So when we do that, when we feed them the E+ diet, that would be this line here. We feed them the E- diet, that would be this line here. The cattle on the E- diet eat that amount in about 15 minutes. All right, boom, they're up here within the first hour. And then rest of the day, yeah, they cleaned it up, but there's not much left. Where these cattle on the E+ diet, it takes them the full 24 hours to consume what they're going to consume that day. It has a major impact on their behavior in terms of how they eat, when they eat, how much they eat, in terms of that. They do everything they can to avoid it, yeah. All right. Some other things going on, other grad students projects, we're looking at some enzyme additives in terms of can we impact digestion in the rumen by adding starch digesting enzymes. Got one student that's working on that. We've had a postdoc who's been here, has been looking at some bioavailability. That is, we look at different sources of seed and different that contain different amounts of these toxic compounds to see if is one seed more toxic than the other, in terms of how rapidly and efficiently these compounds are absorbed and produce a toxic effect. Then look at some endocrine regulation of intake in terms of cattle exposed to fescue as well. And then had another visiting scholar here who's been looking at the role of serotonin in cattle exposed to alkaloids. That's another hormone that dramatically influences intake, influences gut motility, and a lot of these. And so he did several studies while he was here looking at the impact of serotonin on that. And finally, have another student that's looking at, again, limits to intestinal starch digestion and doing some work there. All right. With that, I'll close with my picture. This is a shot of my entire backgrounding operation this year at home. So with that, I'll be happy to entertain any questions that I can. I thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thank you, Dr. Harmon. Any questions for Dr. Harmon? Type them in the chat. I know Dare was impressed with the balloon research, so you hit the right button on that one, Dr. Harmon.
I knew that. I knew that going in. Yeah.
So I've got a question that just thinking about it and watching some of that. So on the endophyte infected forage, so there's a passage rate effect of some sort.
There is. Like I said, you go, it's always just like as a researcher, you always go into that, well, here's what it is. It's motility and it's doing this and it's doing these things. And then when you do all these experiments, well, it doesn't really work like we thought it did. Yeah, there is some effect on passage rate. There is some effect on motility, but they just weren't as large as we thought they would be going into that, or said.
When you actually tried to measure it is what you're
Yes,
saying.
exactly. Yeah, we can measure differences, but they always seem like small differences in terms of magnitude.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, from Jeff Lemcooler, Dr. Harmon looking at fescue toxicity. Whoa, it just jumped away. Let me get back to it. Wouldn't you think that water intake would be higher and liquid in the rumen would be greater rather than less? That's an excellent question. That's a good observation, Jeff. I saw that on the two pans next to each other. One definitely looked more watery than the other. So.
Yeah, we measure water intake in those studies. So we have water meters on all their drinking cups in those animals. And it really it isn't different. Water intake is so tightly coupled to dry matter intake that those two hardly ever differ in terms of that relationship. The more dry matter they eat, the more water they drink. And we don't see a difference. If we keep dry matter intake equal between those treatments, water intake will be equal typically, even though that rumen looks so much soupier. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. And then we've got David Appleman ask, are you still looking at the effect of red clover to reduce fescue toxicity?
Researchers in the USDA are. I know Michael Flythe that I mentioned there, the microbiologist, and Brittany Harmon, they both have multiple studies going on looking at the impact of red clover. Yes.
Dr. Harmon, do you know, I forget, what is the actual compound or whatever that they're attributing to red clover that has the beneficial effect? Do you remember what?
Yes. I do. And if you ask me in about 15 minutes, I'll tell you what it is.
There you go. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you.
No, I was sitting here thinking of that because I actually had a student that worked with Jimmy and we did some of those specific compounds in that vasoconstriction assay that you were talking about. And
okay. I think Dr. Lemcooler just tried to bail us out.
Yeah. What is it, Jeff?
Is it bio? How do you say it? Just unmute there, Jeff.
Biocanin A.
Yes, that's one of them. Yes. Yeah.
All right.
That's what I was going to say, but Jeff beat me to it.
You can't even spell it.
Looking at the balloon still there. All right.
So Dr. Harmon, I've got another quick question for you. As you guys have looked at your starch utilization work and the interest right now with kind of a local beef and finishing cattle maybe more locally, we don't have the steam flakers and that. Thinking about whole corn, because when we talk about feeding whole shell corn in different rations and different situations versus say cracked corn or maybe even high moisture corn, because we can certainly put up high moisture corn. Could you give us a little bit of discussion on maybe those three differences and how the starch digestion may shift from rumen to lower GI?
Yeah. Well, certainly in terms of fermentability, your high moisture corn is going to be the fastest, more digestible in terms of that. You know, there's a reason, you know, your feed yards put up 3 million bushels of high moisture corn, you know, because it's really good feed and it's more digestible in that format. Cracked corn, yeah, you know, it's digestibility will go down. You know, I was trying to give you some numbers on that. You know, probably total track, you know, from 93 to 90, but it's probably a bigger shift within the animal in terms of that. You probably get a bigger impact in the large intestine that we don't often measure. And then with whole corn, you know, you'll start to see a lot more in the feces. You know, and research that was done a long time ago, as long as there's any kind of a crack in those kernels, you still can get pretty good starch utilization. Even when you see kernels in the feces, a lot of those will be empty. And so it's not as bad as you would think. I think a lot of that can be improved with management in terms of feeding whole corn and keeping them feed in front of them all the time where they'll chew better and they don't snarf it down, and things like that can have a bigger impact with whole corn. And you can do quite well with that, I think. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. That's exactly what we try to talk about. And the other challenge we have is sometimes it's $30 to $40 a ton higher for cracked corn over whole shell corn, and you may not get the benefit financially back from that.
Yeah,
that's a really good point, Jeff, because the markup, you know, and yet they could buy whole corn from area farmers too and avoid that markup. So, any other questions for Dr. Harmon? All right, very good. This was excellent. Yeah, very, very good, Dr. Harmon. We appreciate you taking the time to present this for us. And I guess if we want to move on to the next, I can try to share my screen. And as you know, just have any other questions, just feel free to type in the chat box if you think about it as we go on. All right. So the second half of our program tonight, I'll talk a little bit about planning the winter feeding program. You know, winter feeding is thankfully a good distance away time-wise, but it is time to get ready and start planting. It's definitely the height of hay season. You know, we all like to make hay in May, but this year we thought it'd be a very timely topic because we didn't get our good windows to make hay until June, so like a lot of years happen. So we'll go ahead and get started. So in a good winter feeding program, you know, obviously our objective is to meet the nutritional needs of the cow herd as economically as possible. And I put this as a shock factor here. I don't know if Katie has seen any of these pictures. Dr. Van Valen here, she's, you know, just got here in January. But Katie, this is what the road looked like going to the back corral, going past the orchard back in 2009 during the ice storm. And I hope I'm not jinxing us to give us another ice storm this winter, but I thought the shock factor would just let us know that, you know, we can get winter. But honestly, this event, as terrible as it was to live through and to function and have cattle through, it was short-lived. And what gets our cattle a lot of times is more of a chronic, prolonged, wet, cold, mud, that kind of thing we've experienced a lot of the last few years. So winter feeding can definitely be a challenge. Now, winter feeding begins here. It begins here in the sunshine in the field of a hay field, trying to get our hay up and get things going. And I like to admit and tell people right up front, anytime I'm giving a talk on whatever subject I'm talking about, I like to give my biases up front. If I know I have a strong bias that I'm definitely conscious of, and hay, I hate hay. I can't stand hay. I put hay up there with death and taxes. And that may sound a little extreme, but it's a necessary thing we have to deal with and make or buy or purchase or feed or whatever if we're going to be in the cattle business or feed ruminants. So it's necessary, but it's got a lot of downside. It's our most expensive feed stuff. If you want to look at what we get for the amount we have to feed and what we have to spend. But again, it's a necessary deal. So So what we're going to do is just try to go through and see how we can minimize the cost or the limitations or the problems we have with having to deal with hay. Here's some common winter feeding mistakes, and I'm not trying to be arrogant and accuse producers of this. I'm as guilty as anybody of these next few things. Overestimating bale weight. You know, we all think our hay weighs over 1,000 pounds, 1,200 pounds, 1,500 pounds. I do a lot of ration balancing, and I hear, we get that all the time from producers. Underestimating cow weight. I'm going to show some examples here in a second of 1,400 pound cows. And if you don't, I would be willing to guess most people have cattle closer to 1,400 pounds than they do 1,200 pounds. And so I think we do a poor job of estimating that sometimes. And then we underestimate, I think, what our usage or our loss in feeding or storing hay a lot of times. And one good thing about hay storage that has happened since I've been in Kentucky, and really since 1999, 2000, when the Ag Development Board money came about, the cost sharing, CAPE and whatnot, we have built a lot of hay storage facilities in the state. And I think that's been a great deal, great plus, and you just don't drive around in the country and see as much hay stacked outside as you used to. And that's a good thing. But we still have some loss, obviously, and we'll talk about that in a second. I think we give too much credit to protein tubs or lick tanks, and I know that can be a good tool, but a lot of times it definitely has a lot of limitations. So how much hay are we going to need this year? So we're going to try to start planning our winter feeding right now. Well, how many cows do we have? How many days do you think we'll have to feed? How many rolls or bales, whatever we want to call them? We got to dig a little deeper than that. So I think we start with right now, we're putting up hay. Are we buying hay? I've got a neighbor next to me where I've got the farm that's been buying hay. He's been bringing it in, putting it on a rock pad and putting a tarp on it. I mean, he doesn't have a hay structure to put it in, but that's the next best thing. And I admire him for that. So we're going to put this hay inside, like what the picture shows on the left there. We can have some pretty minimal losses from storage, but if we're going to stack it outside, we can have 40-45% loss just from weathering and wicking water from the ground, especially if it's not on a rock pad. And then if we do a poor job of stacking it or lining it in rows and letting the edges touch to where water is going to collect down the tops here, who knows how much loss we're going to get. That's going to compound our loss problem. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is how you're going to feed it. Obviously, that's a pretty extreme picture there on the left, but we still see that sometimes going up and down the road. That's an easy 50% loss of feeding there. That hay doesn't look like much either, but by and large, that's just a nasty situation there. Not a very efficient way to feed. Putting it in some kind of rings is going to minimize our losses. The cone type rings, some of the research is showing the cone type rings that has solid bottoms can maybe get our losses maybe even under 10% in some cases. But, you're still going to have some losses even putting it in rings, but it's going to be significantly better than doing it, obviously without rings. Get a lot of questions on unrolling hay, and I think unrolling hay works if we give a one-day supply and if the ground's not too muddy. And so, you can get into some situations depending on what kind of soil type you're on. I know I've got one rented farm that there's no way I could unroll hay and do any good most times of the winter. It's just too wet. Another place where we run a few calves is it's really good crop ground, really, and it's very well drained. We could probably get away with unrolling some hay at that place. So soil type can come into play there. But unrolling hay, if you give a one-day supply, just to finish that thought, the research has showed you can keep feeding losses to about 15%. So that's something maybe to consider. So how much are they going to eat? So we got to buy enough hay for it to get them, to get through the winter. This is an old slide I have borrowed from Dr. Burris for years and have used it for years. And it just kind of gives, it's nothing absolute, but it kind of gives you that relationship of forage quality and then how that affects intake. And if you look at this, whenever you're budgeting hay, we've got to try to guess at how much these cattle are going to eat, knowing how much they weigh. So we, doing a percent body weight's probably a good way to try to approach that. I like to use 2.5% to start with. Hopefully our hay is going to be in this range, at least right here. We'd hope to get it in 50% TDN or better. But if they'll eat about 2.5%, we're that's not too bad. So let's do a little example here. So let's talk about hay intake versus hay usage. We got a 1,400 pound cow at 2.5% body weight. That's 35 pounds of hay per day. Now that would be in a perfect situation where we have no loss, and we can take that bale from the field to the cow throughout the winter and never have any kind of loss. So we need to adjust that for waste. And let's say we're inside storage, so we're going to have about a 5% loss associated with that. And then we're feeding in maybe simple hay rings, or 15% loss. So about 20% loss or fudge factor needs to be put in there. So now our 2.5% quickly becomes 3%. So, we need to have at least 42 pounds of hay in inventory times however many days we think we're going to feed. Now, that's an individual thing based on your forage system, your rotational grazing, whether you stockpile. If we get a dry spell, in July and August, we may have to feed some hay then. So, if you year in, year out feed 100 days worth of hay or 120 days worth of hay, which is, not too awful bad, you probably need that extra 30 days built in case we have a terrible winter or we have a dry spell in the summer. So we still need to ask the question, how many rolls do I need? How many bales do I need? So we got to get at, how do we convert to that? Unfortunately, most hay, at least cow hay, rolled hay, is sold by the roll, by the bale, and not necessarily by weight. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute where it might behoove us to do that, to consider that. But it's a function that what that bale weighs is a function of size, the density of the bale, and the moisture in the bale. Now, I'm going to keep this talk basically talking about dry hay and not any of our haylage or wheatlage or that kind of thing, or even silage. But we're just going to stick to dry hay for the most part on this deal. But our density can be affected by the model of baler we're using, or that was used to bale that hay, how that baler is set. What's the settings on it? How's it set to bale? How tight it'll roll it? The species of our forage, okay, or the maturity of the forage. All that can affect the density of that bale. Here's some real world deals right here on the farm. You can see the bales on the right. The smaller bales, they're 4x5 rolls. And what's interesting is this, we just been experiencing this, mainly Dr. Van Valen has, because she's in charge of the herd here. And we've got a new roller, brand new fancy, hay roller. And we're having we got a little learning curve there. So it makes a smaller package, but it's got a bale processor in it for when they, to where it chops the hay as it's being baled. You can make a denser roll, but it's a smaller roll. Well, the first one out the gate, the rolls were coming in at 650 pounds. And what Dr. Van Valen needed to figure out, okay, what's our old rolls? We needed to make sure we have enough hay for the winter. So what did our old rolls weigh versus our new? And you can see the old rolls are there on the left, the 5x5s. So we did some weighing. So right out the gate, the new roller was putting bales out at 650 pounds. The old rolls from last year were 1,000 pounds. And so quite a big difference. So if you just decided, if Katie thought she needed 600 rolls to get through the winter, well, it depends on how much the rolls weigh, obviously, right? Now, there are some issues with small versus large packages too, because it comes into waste and storage comes into play. If you're going to put hay in any kind of a smaller package or roll, you really need to think about getting that hay inside, because if you set that kind of hay outside, your percentage of loss is going to be a lot higher. Water's going to wick in the same amount, in a big roll as a large roll, but as a percentage of the whole, you're gonna ruin more of that smaller roll. So that becomes a factor. One thing that the farm crew likes, and that talking to one of the main managers out here on the farm crew pointed out, is that right there. look at the difference in this stack. These are the conventional roller we had, and here's the new roller. He likes, what he's excited about is they can get 3 rungs, three levels, three high here in this barn with this smaller package. So kind of interesting. Now, is that as big a roll as we can make, a 650-pound roll? Well, speaking of that particular manager, I was visiting with him yesterday evening, and he said he called the manufacturer or the dealer, and they've got that, they adjusted that baler. Now that baler's making, 9 to 950 kind of rolls with the same dimensions. So just by changing the settings on the roller and whatnot, and you can kind of see, this is the same, just to illustrate, still about a 57-inch diameter bale of hay there. So interesting to think about. So this kind of brings us to what I think is one of the real handy charts. I know Dr. Lemcooler has it in one of his pubs on this same subject that he borrowed from Jason Banta at A&M here. And this actually appeared in Hay and Forage Grower. But this is a good guide, I think, that you could have to look at if you're buying hay. And it'd be best if you could buy it on weight. A lot of times you're not going to get people to do that. But if you could buy hay, or at least know, or bring your tape measure with you and measure them, and at least see, you might have an idea of what these bales weigh. 5x5s, I guess that hay, according to this 1100, they weighed some of that old hay that was 5x5 was 1,000 pounds. So I mean, it would be a good rough guide, I think, to look at. And then what I think is real handy is this column here. If you could buy it, what does it really cost you if you bought it by the bale versus, depending on what different weights. So interesting chart there. I think that would be good to have. So I think we got time. Let's just let's feed some cows. All right. So let's talk a little bit about nutrition. And our goal at calving is to have these cows in body condition score 6. I gave you 2 pictures here, the spring calver and a fall calver, and I think we would all agree it's a lot easier to hit that goal with our fall calvers, in September coming off of summer grass, as opposed to spring calver coming through, January, February, March, or whatever, whenever we calve. And you can tell this cow's a little thinner, right? Now she just calved. You can see she just calved. She's pretty dehydrated. She may not be as tight, is really as thin as she looks, but she is probably a little thinner than ideal. She's probably in that high 4, low 5 body condition score and whatnot. So that's our goal. And why that's so important is because it affects calf vigor, how quick that calf will get up and nurse. It'll affect the subsequent pregnancy rate and then actually the weaning weight of that year. Here's a neat deal, Colorado State on their Colorado Beef Report that I like to use. And this is thin cows, 3s and 4s versus cows in good shape, 5s and 6s at calving, and how many minutes it took for that calf at birth to stand up. And, an hour for those thin cows, calves out of thin cows, and half hour to 45 minutes. On a cold day, on a nasty day, weather day, when that calf's got to get up, nurse, and survive, plus maybe even, and not necessarily whether you find a dead calf or a chilled calf, but maybe this calf will get compromised on colostrum intake at that window where they need to absorb the right amount of colostrum. And so we might never know that calf was compromised until that calf just falls behind its pen mates or its contemporaries there at weaning time. So I think that's a neat study to look at here. And then obviously we've seen, days to heat advantage to cattle in good shape at calving, and then percent pregnant, huge advantage when we get them in the right shape over here. So our plan needs to be, let's just put some condition on the dry cows. They're the cheapest thing to feed, right? They're cheaper to feed, they eat less, and they don't need as much nutrient dense feed. So less nutrient dense, we're talking hay now, right? So we're talking that we can make a little, get a little bang for our buck with something that's a little more marginal in quality, right? So here are 3 stages of production, and I know we've seen this a lot. We talk about this a lot, and I oversimplified these. So we've got 3 nutritionists, pure nutritionists that I know of on watching this. So don't hit me too bad, but I try to simplify this. Our protein requirements in mid-gestation, but I like to say 7, 9, and 11. That's just easy to remember, okay? And then 50, 55, 60 on the TDN side. So, you know, this is to maintain, at least maintain body condition at those stages. So this would be a dry cow right after pulling that calf off for mid-gestation, late gestation, and then lactation. And then let's put that against what we normally are trying to grow these cattle on as fescue, right? And that fescue growth curve. And you can see in from a spring standpoint, there's the critical area right there. This is where hay is probably going to be short meeting our needs going into calving. And remember, we got to get that cow close to a 6, right, on body condition. Fall calves, a little different. We're trying to get them bred right here in December and January and get them to maintain or try to at least halfway maintain themselves through this bad period here. And we probably don't have much groceries here, so we're doing a lot of winter feeding here. So that's a key area leading into breeding there. So if we're going to do it with hay, we got to know how good is our hay. Is it going to be good enough to meet the needs of those cows in those critical periods? So, you know, there's that picture again. Poor quality hay is a double-edged sword. They can't eat much of it. They just can't get it through their system. It's slower passage. They're going to eat less, and then what they're eating is less nutrient dense. So there's a problem there. So we need to test our hay. We need to test our hay, and this was yesterday. I took this picture, and Katie and I and Blair up at the barn, and I said, well, look at that new hay, how pretty and green. She says, that doesn't mean it's better, and she's right. You can't just go by color. And so you got to test your hay and find out what it has. Here's something interesting that Dr. Toich, our forage specialist here at Princeton, shared with me and said I could use in this. It's what they do every year. I think at least they did it last year. I don't know how long they've done this, but the Eastern Kentucky Hay Contest, these are 592 samples were taken, and those samples averaged 9.7 on protein and 55 on TDN, which is not too bad for an average of that many samples, right? So on average, that would meet the needs of a cow in late gestation, right? So that's the average. I wanted to dig around a little deeper and kind of, see, okay, what did it really mean? What do we really have there in that data set? And if you did some sorting by protein and TDN just to see how many of them would meet the needs of a cow in mid-gestation, about 90 to 91% of the hay would meet the needs of that mid-gestation, right, of a 7 and a 50, right? On late gestation, 50 to 60% of those samples, 60% on protein, 51% on TDN. And then on lactation, to be, samples that were 11% protein and 60% protein. As far as protein goes, 27% met the 11% or better, and only 7% met the 60% TDN or better. And anyone that knows and has tested much hay would understand and would believe that this is pretty typical for grass hay, right? And a lot of the ones that went above this 60 were alfalfas and that kind of thing. But for grass hay, it's hard to get grass hay that's going to fit, especially that TDN requirement for a lactating cow, right? So test our hay. We've got a little simple tool that anybody can use. We made it that simple. And it's the Beef Forage supplement tool. And you can grab, 4 pieces of information off of your hay test, plug them in. You can have it on your phone. It's a web-based app you can load on your phone. Your dry matter, crude protein, NDF, and TDN. You pick your stage of production of those 3 stages, and then you can pick your, and what I like to do, and you can't see the last button down here, it says calculate, but you pick your last button. I just choose all of the feedstuffs. I've got the feedstuffs arranged from corn at the lowest protein to soybean meal, our highest protein. So you put these information in, you choose your stage of production, and in this case, this hay was 9% protein, 64% NDF. And the reason we use NDF is to get a gross estimate of intake. And again, it's a very gross estimate. It's not something very fine-tuned. Intake is hard to predict, especially in cow diets on ad libitum, hay feeding, but we needed somewhere to start. And then the 54% TDN. And you can see this hay would meet like we would expect. It meets that 7 and 50 rule, the 7 for protein and 50 for TDN. So we would expect no supplement is needed, right? Let's go to late gestation. Let's get a little closer to calving. And you can see, remember I said this, you know, at 55 roughly. So we're close. We're close. Just a little bit of something would get it. Here's where that protein block, if you need a convenience product, or if you want to feed a couple pounds of distillers 3 times a week, something like that would fit, you know, and cover you from that standpoint. And then on lactation, we know we're short here. In both cases, we need about 11% protein and about 60 here. So you can see corn is taken out. We have a 6-pound max on corn, and soybean meal, you know, we've got a 4-pound max. But you can see probably the most economical thing here would probably be a soy hull mix to the tune of about 6 pounds, or maybe depending on price of distillers down here. Now, here's the deal. It's hard to get producers motivated to feed much over 4, 5, 6 pounds of any kind of energy feed or concentrate to their cow herd, and with good reason. It's kind of tough to do. It's you know, wading out with buckets and whatnot. You know, I think we should do more with cube feeders and do a little more on that standpoint, but that's a topic for another day. But here's another slant I'd like to look at. How about if we did it with stockpiled forage? What if we, you know, these are some stockpiled forage samples we did from in 2006, 7, and 8 different counties, and look at our proteins, all above the lactating. And some of these samples were taken in March, February, all above the requirements for a lactating cow. Energy, all above the 60 here. Now, every year it doesn't happen this way. We've had some really cold, prolonged cold spells that really chills us, you know, through the mulch and through the thatch, and actually chills this stockpile grass, you know, a lot colder, and we'll slip in quality. But, you know, by and large, our stockpile fescue usually exceeds our hay that we have on hand. So this will usually meet those needs. So I guess my question, and the last thing I'm going to go through, is just 2 or 3 slides just for some food for thought, provoke a little thinking. For spring calvers especially, are we doing this thing backwards? You know, I grew up in the deep South and we planted ryegrass, and we never hardly turned out a dry cow on ryegrass. You waited till they calved, and then you turn out pairs on your ryegrass, okay? Because that ryegrass was so precious and cost so much to grow. And I think our stockpile fescue could really, really help us from that standpoint. You know, should we be feeding hay to these mid-gestating dry cows back here in September and December, stockpiling the whole farm and grazing stockpile grass January through March? So we did this trial back in 2006, or a demo, I guess I should say, there in Gracey, and we did 41 cows on 70 acres. Weaned these cows in mid-September, a couple weeks earlier than normal. We ran them on some corn stalks for, you know, a couple weeks, and then we put them in a dry lot and fed them hay. And then we turned out on stockpile grass. I wanted him to hold out to the 1st of January. It was just killing him. He had to turn them out. So he started grazing December 16th, and he grazed all the way until spring grass. That hay averaged 10% protein, 51% TDN, so pretty decent hay, maybe a little lower on energy than what we wanted. But what was interesting is that, and then here's our stockpile figures here, tested pretty, you know, very well for lactating cows. What was interesting is that hay at that level, dry cows in a dry lot put 135 pounds of gain on those dry cows, just on hay alone, no supplement. Body condition score, we scored them in December, and then we scored them in March, basically maintained in that mid-5 range roughly. Calves, you know, the next year, 94% of his calves calved by March 1st, so we don't feel like we altered anything there reproduction-wise. One thing that was interesting, though, is this was going into the spring of 2007. What happened in the spring of 2007? It was the Easter freeze. So the Easter freeze really knocked a hole in our hay crop. Then we had the 2007 drought. This particular individual always had 2 of the commodity cost share barns full of hay that he put up every year. He usually used nearly both barns every year. That year, by doing it this way, those cows ate less. He used less hay. He saved a whole barn. He was able to use that barn of hay to get through the drought that summer. So interesting. These are just some pictures from that deal we did in January. The cows right before calving. Here's some in March out on that calved out on the stockpile grass. But what I'd like to kind of tweak this a little bit, I noticed that Jeff, and I know we're getting long here, I'm gonna wrap this up. Dr. Lemcooler put a YouTube video. It hit my Facebook the other day on bale grazing, and we've got a lot of, bale grazing and stuff can get a lot of people can get kind of stirred about bale grazing. They like to shoot holes in it. It's not perfect, but maybe if we bale graze these spring calving dry cows on our poorest paddock in September, that September through December period, maybe, and I just put this farm we had done another trial on. This happened to be a poor paddock on that farm. What if we would bale graze and concentrate dry cows right here? In that time period, it's drier that time of the year. We can pump nutrients from that hay onto this ground, so we can fertilize this ground with the hay we're feeding. Let this whole farm stockpile. And then we can just rotate or strip graze this stockpile grass the rest of the winter and have better feed, better conditions for our cows to calve in for the rest of the winter. So just food for thought. I think it is something that's worth looking at. So with that is all I have. If there are any questions, I think, Dare, you're going to share the slide for the Cape deal or whatever. But we can go from there.
Yep, I'll get that put up.
Yep. So let's see. Any questions? Everybody left.
You still got plenty of them on there.
There you go.
They're pondering.
Right, there you go. Yeah, through a crazy idea there. Yeah, that farm we did in 2006 and 7, they still do. They're still practicing that deal. Now, some of the drought years, you don't stockpile as much grass. And so they've had to alter, the plan a little bit from time to time, but they still try to feed hay at weaning and try to let the farm recover and grow up in stockpile. So they've been doing it since then. So.
Hey, Kevin, did you do economics on that?
We did, just kind of rough economics, but nothing really comparative, and I didn't put those slides in there. It was 06 numbers, the biggest thing that he liked is the fact that he saved a barn full of hay. I mean, and I know that's not, that's about as anecdotal as you can get, but he said, I always basically run through 2 of these commodity barns of hay. I saved just about a whole barn full of hay. And it couldn't have, and sometimes it just pays to be lucky. We couldn't have timed that thing in a better time. We had a perfect fall in 06 to stockpile. And then we had that Easter freeze, and then we had the drought. And I mean, if anybody needed a extra barn full of hay, it couldn't have been in a better time.
Well, you'd think that'd be quantifiable, right?
I think it could be, yeah. Yep.
Hey, I actually had another question for Dr. Harmon, if he can unmute, if he's still around and hadn't dozed off. He's older than me.
How can you help not dozing off listening to Kevin?
That's a good point, too. Hey, Dave, would you mind sharing, and I know you mentioned it some, but just kind of the relationship that our group has with the USDA group and some of the, I mean, really and truly the importance of that USDA group, being here in Kentucky. And so I know there's some talk about maybe a building or whatever. I don't know what you may know about that, but just share a little bit with these guys, some about the USDA partnership.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That's a really good point, because I think it really is a very, very successful one. That's not just animal science, it's the whole college. I mean, I don't know how many people interact with them, but it'd probably be, 30 researchers, not just the 3 or 4 we have in animal science. But the kind of how the system works is, you know, they have space in the building next to us, Ag North, and they pay the college something for use of that space. And in turn, that money's made available for research grants that relate to their project interest. And so that's where a lot of the fescue toxicosis research and funding comes from, is through those funds that they pay to the college. And then, so we do cooperative research. And then, as I said, that we share facilities. They do any animal work they do at the beef unit, or animals in our building. A lot of our students share their laboratory facilities on a very regular basis. They're very helpful and open to that. And they even helped, you know, Dr. Flythe and Jimmy Klotz both help team teach the Ruminant Nutrition Corps. So they're even involved in our courses. They supervise occasional grad student as well. And so it's just a really, to me, a win-win kind of relationship where in terms of their, I guess, resources, you know, they get space, they get animals, they get access. And it probably in terms of what the USDA usually pays, it's very efficacious for them and it's very beneficial to us. And I don't think we do a good enough job of touting that to anyone and everyone. So I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's a phenomenal opportunity when we were able to get that that
Yeah.
USDA group brought in here, and what it's allowed our department in particular. I mean, I see it the most in the beef group. I know it does
Yeah.
help a lot of things, but that's what I see it, where I see it a lot.
The new building won't be a bad addition either.
All right. Any other questions for Dr. Harmon or for myself or any of our specialists online here? You can see that Dare put the code up for if you're using this for CAPE education, the code would be beef buck, just like we've been doing. Our password is our code that you need to put on your CAPE deal. Next week, same time, we've got Dr. Eric Manzant. He's an associate professor, and he's going to talk about temperament as it relates to performance in growing cattle. And that's an interesting topic. There's been a lot of research. I know Iowa State has done a lot with temperament, cattle disposition affecting feedlots. So that I'm really looking forward to that. And then Dr. Henning, I actually heard this talk at Union County. I think it's going to be basically what he gave at Union County this winter before we went into shutdown, and the basics of baleage. Real interesting talk from Dr. Henning. Baleage is getting more and more popular. You know, these wrappers are getting more cost effective. I think you definitely want to tune in for both of these talks here. Should be very, very well worth your time. All right. If there's not any, let's see, let's check the chat one more time. Anything else? I think we will sign off for tonight. Appreciate everyone taking time out on a nice, cool evening, which will be pretty rare here going forward. And thank you for taking time to tune in and listen to the seminar.